Okay, so Matthew chapter 20, verse 17. Now, Jesus was going up to Jerusalem. On the way, he took the 12 aside and said to them, "We're going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles to be mocked and flogged and crucified. On the third day, he will be raised to life." Then the mother of Zebedee's son came to Jesus with her sons, and kneeling down, asked a favor of him. "What is it you want?" he asked. She said, "Grant that one of the two sons of mine may sit at your right and the other at your left in your kingdom." "You don't know what you're asking," Jesus said to them. "Can you drink the cup I'm going to drink?" "We can," they answered. Jesus said to them, "You will indeed drink from my cup, but to sit at my right or left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they have been prepared by my Father." When the 10 heard about this, they were indignant with the two brothers. Jesus called them together and said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to be great amongst you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." As Jesus and his disciples were leaving Jericho, a large crowd followed him. 2 blind men were sitting by the roadside, and when they heard that Jesus was going by, they shouted, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us." The crowd rebuked them and told them to be quiet, but they shouted all the louder, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us." Jesus stopped and called them. "What do you want me to do for you?" he asked. "Lord," they answered, "we want our sight." Jesus had compassion on them and touched their eyes. Immediately they received their sight and followed him.
Thank you, Tom. The other day, my children were watching the film Aladdin, you know, the original classic cartoon. And I'm sure you know the story. The young vagrant Aladdin falls for the unhappy Princess Jasmine, much to the frustration of the evil wannabe Sultan Jafar. And then Jafar banishes Aladdin, and when he does so, Aladdin chances across this magic lamp in which lies a genie. And the genie offers Aladdin 3 wishes. Anything that he wants will be his. And it's a very enticing concept. I mean, which of us would not want the opportunity to be given 3 wishes? And in the case of Aladdin, of course, what he wants is to win the heart of the princess, and so he becomes Prince Ali, Fabulous He, Ali Ababwa, if you know the song, and the story goes on. I don't know if you noticed that in this passage that we just read, 2 times Jesus is approached with a request. Verse 21, by the mother of James and John, and in verse 32, by 2 blind men. And twice Jesus says, "What do you want?" Or words that are similar. What is it that you want? What do you want me to do for you? And I think we're supposed to see those 2 requests in parallel. They show us 2 very different approaches to Jesus. The 2 groups ask for 2 very different things. And as we read this passage this evening, it begs the question first, well, what would you ask? If you could ask Jesus something, what would you want? What would you like him to do for you? If you could ask God one question, sorry, not one question, for one thing, and you knew he would give it to you, what would you ask for? Well, in this section in Matthew's Gospel, Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem, and he's been teaching about the kingdom of God, the rule that he's come to bring. And we saw last week that this kingdom is for the humble, not the proud, anyone who will receive it like a child. And this week, as Jesus continues on the road, we learn about what it looks like to follow him. If we make Jesus king, if we enter into the kingdom, what is that going to be like? And so what we're trying to do this evening is to allow Jesus to set our expectations of the Christian life, but also to orientate our hearts to want what he says is most important for us. So it all begins as Jesus takes his disciples aside and tells them again what's going to happen to him in Jerusalem. Have a look there at verse 17 or verse 18. He says this. He says, we're going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They'll condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles to be mocked and flogged and crucified. And the third day he will be raised to life. Now, if we've been following carefully, we'll know this isn't the first time he's predicted his death. In fact, it's the third time. And with each time Jesus predicts his death, we get just a little bit more color and a little bit more intensity. What is new here? Well, two ideas. The first is the idea of total rejection. He's going to be handed over to the Jews, who will condemn him to death. And then they're going to hand him over to the Gentiles, the Romans, who are going to kill him. So it's the world, the whole world, against Jesus, total rejection. But also utter humiliation. You notice Jesus is going to be mocked and flogged and crucified. It's the first time we hear about the mode of his death, crucifixion in all of its agony and shame and horror. One writer put it, this is no glorious martyrdom, this is ugly, sordid butchery. And yet, despite these two ideas, total rejection, utter humiliation, we hear again at the end there that on the third day he will be raised to life. And so far in Matthew's gospel, every time we've heard Jesus predict his death, he follows it with teaching on discipleship. And that is what it means to follow him. And this happens again. And the reason is that the cross is the pattern of the Christian life. There's a tight link between his death and our discipleship. And so this evening we learn about what it looks like to follow Jesus. And we're going to see three things. Here's the first. Following Jesus means suffering before glory. So in verse 20, the mother of Zebedee's sons are James and John, she comes to Jesus. Her name, we think from elsewhere, is Salome. And she's possibly his aunt on his mother's side. So she's close, she's family, and she comes, and you notice she kneels, and she has a favor to ask. And he says there, verse 21, what is it you want? Now we might think by her posture that she comes humbly, but then if you read her request in verse 21, it's actually quite brazen, it's quite shocking. She says, grant that one of these two sons of mine, that is James and John, may sit at your right and the other at your left in your kingdom. Now, the backdrop to this request is in 1928, where Jesus promises his disciples, he says, when the Son of Man sits on his glorious throne, you who followed me will also sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. So the disciples have been told they're going to share in Jesus' rule. But to this woman and to her sons, well, that's not enough. They don't just want to have a throne, they want the best throne, the closest throne, the greatest throne, a throne on the right and a throne on the left. That's what the brothers want, and it's what their mother wants for them. And of course, when we read this today, what we're seeing is a pretty stark example of the deep-rooted desire for self-glory. That is what this is all about. And what are we to make of that? Well, a number of thoughts. Here's the first. It is shocking. It's particularly shocking, I think, because Jesus has just predicted his own death. You would have thought that he needs their support, not to hear their vain dreams of glory. It's shocking. It's also quite childish. The child is given a huge toy, but they're not happy. She wants the biggest toy, not just a big toy, but the biggest. And that's the kind of sense you get with this request. It's shocking, it's childish, but at the same time, it is also deeply exposing. As we read it, you and I, we can't point the finger here at the mother or at James and John, because we know that this very same desire lives and breathes and beats in our hearts, in my heart, and in your heart. And we're talking about the problem of pride, this unquenchable thirst for honor, for status, for admiration, for glory. Theologian Richard Hooker said this, and it's a bit old-fashioned, but you'll follow it fine. He said this about pride. He said, pride is a vice which cleaveth so fast unto the hearts of men, that if we were to strip ourselves of all faults one by one, we should undoubtedly find it the very last and hardest to put off. You see, looking at this request is a bit like looking in the mirror. It's exposing. Notice too that it is subtle. See, it involves a mother's desire for her sons. And I think we're seeing something here of a temptation for any parent. And that is the temptation to seek to enhance our name through them. We may boast about their successes. We may push them in a certain direction. We'll probably tell ourselves we want what's best for them, but lurking is this desire for self-glory. And that's quite subtle. But perhaps worst of all, it is particularly tragic, because what it involves is using Jesus to promote ourselves. And that, when you think about it, does seem particularly tragic and sad. So this desire for self-glory, it's shocking, it's childish, it's exposing, it's subtle, and it's tragic. And the question for us is, well, where do you and where do I experience this desire for self-glory? What does Jesus make of it all? Well, verse 22, Jesus says, you don't know what you're asking. Can you drink the cup I am going to drink? Well, you notice James and John, they say we can. Jesus says you will, but I can't grant this particular request. It's not for me to give, it's for my Father. And what Jesus is doing with his answer is he's trying to move the conversation on from glory, the thrones, to suffering, the cup. The cup. Can you drink the cup I'm going to drink? What's that about? Well, the cup it's a picture of his suffering. You may remember later on in Gethsemane, in the garden, just before he dies, he prays to the Father, take this cup from me. What's he talking about? He's talking about his death. In the Old Testament, drinking the cup to its bitter dregs is a symbol for facing the wrath of God. And just think of a cup filled with poison. You drink it and it will kill you. You see what's going on here is that Jesus is going to die, and his death is not going to be an ordinary death. His death, but by dying, he will bear the sins of the world. He will face the wrath of God. He will stand where you and I deserve to stand. As Isaiah said, he will be pierced for our transgressions and crushed for our iniquity. He's going to drink the cup. But here's the thing, it's not just Jesus. Did you notice the sobering promise? Verse 23, he says, you will indeed drink from my cup. Now, it's not that Christians are going to suffer in exactly the same way as Jesus. I'm not going to bear other people's sins, but there is a sense, can you see, that we will suffer like him. You will indeed drink from my cup, says Jesus. It's the promise he makes not just to these disciples, but to every Christian. Remember 16 verse 24, he says, if anyone would come after me, they must deny themselves, take up the cross and follow me. Jesus says, look, I cannot offer you a VIP seat in the stadium, but I can offer you a place in the arena against the gladiators and against the lions. Yes, glory is going to come, but you must see it is suffering before glory. And for James, listening in, well, I don't know if you remember, we read in Acts that he was the first apostle to be martyred. And John, well, he's there right at the end of the Bible in Revelation, spending his last days in painful loneliness, in exile on a prison island. And the question for us as we come to this evening is, do we see what following Jesus involves? It's going to involve suffering. Jesus says, you will indeed drink from my cup. That is the promise. It's not one of those verses, you put on the fridge and you celebrate, but it is a verse that we have to remember. How are we going to suffer? Well, of course, there's going to be the general suffering that we would endure as human beings living in a fallen world. We will get diseases, we will face injustice, we will die. But of course, there is also the specific suffering for the Christian, suffering that is going to be unique to being Christians: spiritual attack, discouragement, loneliness, persecution, betrayal, the ongoing battle with indwelling sin. Now, I don't know what it's going to be like for you, but I can guarantee you, if you're going to follow Jesus, there is going to be a cup to drink. That's what he says. You will indeed drink from my cup. And we have to hear this. So many Christians trip up on this very point. Perhaps they get drawn into Jesus with the promise of prosperity, without realizing that most of those promises are for the future. And in the present, yes, of course, there is great joy following Jesus now, but it is also going to involve great suffering. Do you see that? Jesus says, following him, suffering before glory. That's the first thing. What happens next is that the other disciples, we're told, pick up what is going on. And they're not totally happy. In fact, they're pretty angry. Verse 24, we read they're indignant. And it's probably not a righteous anger. The issue probably is that they're thinking, if only we got in there first. And so what Jesus does is he takes the opportunity to speak to all of the disciples about this issue of pride. And here's the second thing we see. Following Jesus, it involves service, not status. Jesus says, look, you know how it works in the world. Verse 25, he says, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. He says, you know how greatness works in the world. People seek authority. They seek status. They seek power. And greatness is equated with those things. The phrase there, high officials, literally means great ones. Greatness is associated with being at the top. I was reading an article just the other day with Marina Wheeler, the ex-wife of Boris Johnson. And she was saying when he became prime minister, she wasn't surprised at all because, well, he'd always wanted to be prime minister. That was what he was always speaking about. It was his great ambition to get to the top, like many people in our world, to get to the top. But Jesus is saying, look, you must understand that doesn't mean greatness. That's not how you're to think if you're going to be my follower. Verse 26, not so with you. If you want to be great, says Jesus, don't seek greatness by the standards of this age. Verse 26, he says, instead, whoever wants to be great among you must be your servant. Whoever wants to be first must be your slave. So Jesus points to the people who are at the very bottom of the social pile, servants and slaves. And he says, this is true greatness. And that is interesting, isn't it? Because he's not saying it's wrong to want to be great. Ambition is not wrong. It's not wrong to want to make a mark, to live life well. But he is saying our vision for greatness must be radically redefined. Now you might wonder, well, what is it about a servant or a slave that makes them particularly great? And I don't think the point is that there's anything inherently good about being at the bottom of the pile in society. But what he's saying is that whatever we do, we need to do it like servants, because that is what Jesus himself is like. Verse 28, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. You see, if we really want to understand what greatness is all about, we need look no further than Jesus. And just think about it. He didn't arrive on earth in dazzling splendor on a red carpet with an entourage of servants. He didn't show off his muscles or exalt his intelligence. He didn't showcase his power, perform to the crowd. He didn't belittle his opponents. He didn't signal his virtue, extend his term, or flash his money. By human standards, Jesus was not great. He went to the bottom of the pile in the back of the queue. He endured what we read about here that he's going to endure, the heartache of betrayal, the injustice of condemnation, the shame of mocking, the pain of flogging, the agony of crucifixion. And he utterly subverted the standards of this age. At the end of World War I, the pastor and poet Edward Shillito wrote the poem Jesus of the Scars. And in it, he considers just how different Jesus was to all the other gods. Let me just read you the final verse. He says, the other gods were strong, but thou wast weak. They rode, but thou didst stumble to a throne. But to our wounds, only God's wounds can speak, and not a God has wounds, but thou alone. And why did Jesus do that? Why is this greatness? Well, he did it, we see, to ransom us. The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. And that really is the very center and the heart of the good news of Christianity. So you and I, we stand condemned before God by our sin, and rightly so. And we also stand bound by our sin. We can't change ourselves. And yet Jesus died to set us free, a ransom. That's a payment that frees someone from slavery. And that is exactly what Jesus did on the cross. His death sets us free from the slavery of sin, from the penalty, from the power, and one day from the presence. He did for us what we could never do for ourselves. He came to not to be served, but to serve. And when you think about the world we live in, the world of ego and rights and self-promotion and vanity, God says, just don't think about that. That is not greatness in my sight. What brings a smile to the face of God? It is service. And that is what Jesus did. That's what he wants for us. Following Jesus, it's about service, not status. And the question is, well, do you actually believe that? I honestly think this is one of the hardest of Jesus' teaching to actually believe. I think it's so ingrained in us, particularly if we are male, that greatness is about status. I mean, so much of the time in our own Christian subculture, when we think of greatness, we think, well, that's being a speaker or a theologian or evangelist, or maybe a worship leader or a social critic. Maybe it's being known or being admired or gifted, or it's being in a church that's big or popular or growing or busy. And we have our great ones, people we look up to, sort of celebrities who we admire, whose words we hang on. And Jesus said that none of those things necessarily entails greatness at all. And the question is, do you believe that? And just before Jesus died, remember, he was in the temple and he was looking for an example to his disciples of greatness. And he looked beyond the leaders of the time. And he looks at this little old lady who gave what she had. And he says that is what it looks like to follow me. That is greatness. And the question is, do we believe it? Do we believe that being a servant is greatness? And will we pursue a humble service? A friend of mine has a text, a framed text on his wall, which says, "Seek not great things for yourself." That's a great verse to have in mind. Here's what John Newton said to a younger pastor. He said, "Oh, to be little in our own eyes. If the Lord is pleased to bless you, he will undoubtedly make you humble, for you cannot be either happy or safe, or have any probable hope of abiding usefulness without it." This is what following Jesus is all about. It's about service, not status. But one more thing to see from this passage about following Jesus, and here it is. Following Jesus is about seeking mercy, not privilege. So as Jesus moves on, we read about two blind men sitting at the roadside who hear that Jesus is going by, and they start shouting. It's quite a scene, just imagine it. There's a whole group of people heading in one direction, and I guess probably relatively noisy, being a whole crowd, and yet they can hear very clearly two men shouting. They're blind, presumably they don't quite know which direction Jesus is in to shout, but they get a general sense, and they shout after Jesus. Verse 30, did you see they say, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us." That's what they're shouting. And the crowd are a bit annoyed at them. They say, "Please stop." And then they just keep on going. They shout even more. They can't see, but they've got voices. All they can do, they shout. And Jesus hears, and he stops, and he turns to them, and he calls them. And it's that penetrating question again, verse 32, "What do you want me to do for you?" And they say, "Lord, we want our sight." And Jesus looks at them. He has compassion on them. He's moved by their blindness, and he touches them and he heals them, and they can see, and they follow him on the road. And that's what happens. What to make of it? Well, a few things to notice. The first thing to notice is that though these men are physically blind, spiritually speaking, well, they actually seem to see more than most people. They call Jesus Lord, Son of David, Messiah. I think that's pretty remarkable. Most people haven't really got there at all with Jesus. The second thing is that in the Gospels, there is a connection between physical sight and spiritual sight. Earlier on, when Jesus spoke about teaching in parables, he said he was in part teaching in parables to confuse people, to divide people, so that though seeing physically, they do not see spiritually. To his disciples, he said, "Blessed are your eyes because they see," which is a reference to spiritual sight. And what that means, I think, is that when these blind men ask for sight, of course they're interested in physical sight, but it may well be there's a lot more going on as well. They're interested in spiritual sight. That is, they want to see Jesus for who he is, to know him. And if that's true, it's no surprise. I don't think that they then follow him on the road. And the third thing to notice is that their request, as we've already seen, is contrasted to that of James and John. That's where I want us to land this evening. You see, James and John want Jesus, in part at least, because of what he can give them, for the sake of personal privilege. It's this genie idea of God. God, give me what I want on my terms. Make me great on my terms. But did you see what the blind men want? They cry out twice for mercy. That's what they want. They plead for mercy. That mercy is the idea of not getting what you deserve. It's God's undeserved favor, his compassion, his pity, his kindness, his love. That is what they want. And it really is quite remarkable how Jesus responds. So it's very possible for you and I in our sin to think that Jesus would be repulsed by us. If he really knew what was going on, if he knows my heart, he knows my mind, he knows what's going on, to imagine, well, if I were to ask for mercy, he would say, you don't know what you're asking for. How can I show mercy to you? You're unworthy. Like a COVID patient coming towards us, don't come near me. Don't. But you notice that was not Jesus' response. This time he doesn't say, you don't know what you're asking for. Verse 34, he has compassion. He looks at these blind men, and his heart breaks. He heals them. And see, that is what following Jesus is about for us too. It's about seeking mercy, not privilege. See, often we want privilege, but we see here that what we need is mercy. And when we ask for privilege, Jesus says, you don't know what you're asking for. But when we come to our senses and we cry out for mercy like these blind men, he looks on us in love and compassion and pity, and he holds out his nail-pierced hands. He touches us and he heals us again and again and again. Now, I don't know what you want God most for. I don't know what you think you need most today. But this is what Jesus says we need most, and that is mercy. We need to cry out to God for mercy, for help, for forgiveness, to be freed from sin in all of its ugly power. And the encouragement here is that despite the depths and ugliness of our sin, maybe we've seen it in our pride this evening, Jesus will respond with compassion when we cry out for mercy, because he's drunk the cup, because he's paid the ransom, because he's given his life, because he lives to intercede, and because he looks at us and he loves us. And so if we're going to follow Jesus, we need to be those who seek mercy, not privilege. If we're not Christians this evening, maybe for the first time crying out to God, God, forgive me my sins. Or maybe if we are Christians for the millionth time, because that is what following Jesus is all about, seeking mercy, not privilege. Just a few questions then, and I don't suppose to get through them all, but let's see what I can do. It's just a question there about where does it say in the Old Testament, the idea of the cup. So just a number of places. So for example, Jeremiah 25, 15 and 16, Psalm 75 verse 8, Psalm 88, 7, Isaiah 51, 17. Those are just a number of examples where this is a kind of common picture of God's wrath. Question here to do with the idea of seeking not your own good, seeking not glory for yourself, and yet knowing that following Jesus is going to benefit us greatly. And I think the point is there's a sense in which if you really seek your good, then of course you will follow Jesus and you'll benefit loads. So there's a right sense in which we should be concerned for our welfare or good. But I think the glory thereafter is a bit different. That's more a kind of a self-glory that is not honoring to God. There's more just about the attention coming on us. And I think that I suspect that's the key difference, really. It's right to seek our good, which will glorify God, but it's wrong to seek our glory in a way which kind of sidesteps God. Question here about positions of influence, being respected, leading a quiet life. I think the idea of being a servant or a slave, I think it's kind of a mindset. It doesn't mean you can't take a position of influence and authority, but the point is that leadership for the Christian is a servant leadership, and that's what Jesus demonstrated. He wasn't literally a servant. He was a preacher, a prophet, and so on, but he did it with a servant mindset. And that's the kind of radical call that he calls us to, is that whatever we do, whether it be being a servant or whether it be being a leader, we're to do with a servant mindset. And so it doesn't mean that we won't have positions of power, but we're to do it in a radically different way. Final question, anything on killing the love of self-exaltation? In many ways, this is going to be a huge challenge, and will happen slowly, as much Christian growth does. But I think from this passage we see that the way to do that, to make progress in fighting the ego, is to admire Jesus and to love him, and to keep coming back to the fact that he says greatness is in service. And I guess that's, the more we admire him and love him, the more we'll think, okay, I must fight those ridiculous thoughts of self-promotion. And I guess that check is a key one.